Hello and welcome back to How to Teach the Bible, preaching class, and we are gonna just jump right back into where we left off. This here is the template, and we are going to be breaking this down. This video is going to be on the sermon idea. Now, the sermon idea is what is essentially your main point, and I'm using that language right now because we're gonna try and get rid of the idea of points later. But for the sake of communicating, you can kind of think of the sermon idea as a main point. Your sermon idea is essentially the message of your sermon, and that's the way we should really think about our sermons. We are communicating a message, a singular message that we really want people to walk away with. And so, if people walk away and they don't walk away with that particular message, you've essentially kind of failed in your sermon of for communicating what it is you're trying to communicate. So we really are trying to communicate a message to our audience, and that could be anything depending on the passage. The passage is going to dictate that, but we want our audience to all walk away with the same message, and that is our sermon idea. So as I said, this is the essentially the sermon. This is the message of the sermon. But as I just alluded to, and it's hard to move away from the language, it's really the message of the text. We got to think of ourselves as preachers, not necessarily constructing a message or not necessarily constructing something that we want to preach to people, but more as people that are passively reading the Word of God and seeing what the Lord is teaching in the text and communicating that. So we're a little bit more passive in that we're not really choosing what it is that we want to preach as much as we are reading and responsibly deriving what it is the text is saying. So that's really the message for the text. We want it to be brought out of the Bible, not from our brains or not from our hearts, of, this is what I want to tell people. Rather, it's something that we see in the text and we say, this is what the Lord is communicating in the Bible. This is what I will be preaching on this week. So if we can kind of get into that mentality that it's not about the pulpit isn't a place where I get to rant. The pulpit isn't a place where I get to talk to people about the things that weigh on my heart. The pulpit isn't the place that I get to tell people my pet peeves or I get to address certain things that I hate. The pulpit is the place in which the scriptural passage that I'm working through gets preached. That is, the Lord is teaching the entire way through these scriptural passages. And I never know what I'm going to talk about the following week because that passage will bring it up. And so as I'm reading through the text, the Bible is telling me what I will be teaching on every week. So we're a little bit passive in that sense. That being said, I'm only saying all of that to stress how much your sermon idea will be derived from the Bible. I'm just stressing that because I don't want us to think of ourselves as topical preachers in which we kind of just decide what we want to say. To be frank, it's actually very relieving because instead of having to think about, what can I talk about this week? You really have an unlimited source of sermons and ideas uh, to be preaching on for the rest of your life. You choose a text, maybe you just choose a epistle or a book, and you just start going through it verse by verse, chapter by chapter, book by book. And as you read through, you uncover sermon ideas, you uncover messages, you uncover what it is the Bible's teaching, and that's what you preach on. So to me, it's actually very relieving because I don't ever have to think up of an entire sermon I want to preach. I read the Bible and it tells me what sermon I'm going to preach. So that's kind of our sermon idea as derived from the text. Now that being said, when we want people to walk away from our sermon, we might ask them as they're walking out the doors, "Hey, what was that sermon about?" And you don't really want the person to be explaining the entire sermon or explaining all these different things and maybe what they got out of it. That's really good, especially if they understood something from the points that really hit home. It's really great to hear stuff like that because it says that they're paying attention. But more so, what you want is you want them to walk away with your sermon idea. If you were to ask someone, rather, as they're walking out, hey, what was the sermon about? What you hope is that they can repeat your sermon idea. And that's how important this sermon idea is. Uh, that being said, we want our sermon idea, as it already says right here, because I have pre-filled that in, we want our sermon idea to be one simple sentence. One simple sentence. If I can actually exaggerate this, I would say you want it to be one simple statement. Um, it's okay to have a question, I guess. You really don't want it to be a rhetorical question because you want it to be simple, right? Rhetorical questions involve two steps. There's the rhetorical question and then the implied answer. So you want people to get it. You don't want any obstacles. One simple statement, something that ends with a period. Your sermon idea will be one simple sentence. You got to boil down the message into one simple sentence, one concept that people can walk away with. And that's really important because if you don't understand your passage to the point in which you can communicate it in one simple sentence, you don't actually understand your passage. You need to spend more time in your passage. You need to spend more time on what it's trying to communicate. And if you find it very difficult, you're you're kind of likely that you went in one of two ways. Either one, you chose too little of a passage, so maybe you're working with only two verses and you're like, what do I get out of this? And so maybe you're having a rough time communicating it in one simple sentence because you don't have enough to work with. But more likely, and this is often where new preachers fall into, is that they have too big of a passage. Very often, I find that when I say, hey, go ahead and choose whatever passage you want, come back to me so I can okay it, and then go ahead and start working on it. Very often when I do that, what I often get is people will come back to me and they'll give me something like a whole chapter. Like I want to I wanted all of Psalm 119. It's like, okay, you're going to have to slim this down a little bit. You're going to have to choose a narrow portion because you have essentially three sermons in the passage that you've chosen. So you might have a really hard time trying to efficiently communicate these three entire sermons of a passage, and that's why you're struggling to find a main point. Those are kind of the two ways that you can err that might be the reason why you're struggling with it. And I'm hoping that maybe we can actually work together on that if that is one of the things. But if you're working by yourself and you're really struggling to communicate your sermon idea and you're really struggling to figure it out, it may be that you're just struggling to wrestle with the text, or it could be that you chose too little or too big of a passage. So um, those are pitfalls that I wanted to make you aware of. Nevertheless, we still need to be able to get our understanding, our message from the passage to one simple sentence. Now, you might be asking me, how do you do that? How do you construct a sermon idea? And there's kind of a process to it, to be honest. Because we want it derived from the Bible, this is going to naturally be derived from the Bible. And so I'm just going to move down here in this document. And because it's going to be derived from the Bible, I'll go ahead and bold this a little bit so that way you guys can see it. We'll just bring it to like size, maybe a 20 font. All right. So because it's going to be derived from the Bible, we're going to come to what is called a textual idea. And the textual idea sounds like the sermon idea. That's on purpose. The textual idea is the message that is being communicated from the text. Now, if we want a definition, one that I've constructed here, and I can just copy and paste it. if we want a definition, the textual idea is this. The textual idea is what the original author intends to communicate to the original audience. So the textual idea is what the original author intends to communicate to the original audience. There are two characters at play here, the original author and the original audience. So we can think of this as, what does Paul wish to communicate to whoever the recipients of the epistle are? The Colossians, the Thessalonians, the Galatians, the Philippians. What does Paul intend to communicate through this passage to the Philippians? And that will be our textual idea. And we'll frame that in sort of a sentence that sounds like, Paul wishes for the Philippians to know X, or Paul wants to communicate X to the Philippians. And that's the way it'll come across. And once we've done that, we can then move into the, I did SI because that's exactly how I have it in my template. All right, so we can then move into the sermon idea by pretty much most of the time it's a one-to-one. And what I mean by that is, very often the textual idea, if we've worked with it well and understood the text, the textual idea can often be the very same message for the church today. So very often it's a one-to-one. Paul wants the Philippians to know this. Well, God wants the Christian church to know this, and so they're kind of the same. And there's a real simple way to transition your textual idea to the sermon idea. A little bit more rarely, but it does indeed happen. So you want to be aware of this, that sometimes cultural elements are in play in the text. And so what we want is to understand the more universal principle behind the text. So we transition from the textual idea to the sermon idea. Now that sounds very philosophical and that's all up in the air, and you're probably thinking I'm not quite following. Well, that's okay. If we were talking about the Levitical law in the sacrifice, we might say the textual idea is Moses wants the Israelites to know that sacrifice is required to reconcile their relationship to God. Okay, is that a one-to-one? So Christians need to sacrifice to reconcile their relationship to Christ, or relationship to God. Well, not really, because we don't sacrifice lambs, right? And so that's not a one-to-one anymore. But what's the universal principle? Sacrifice is required to reconcile your relationship with God. Well, that's a good universal principle that is derived from the text. It just takes a little bit more working to understand the principle behind the text. So it's not a one-to-one, because we see the cultural elements of the sacrificial Levitical system of the ancient Israelites, and we're going to communicate now to the universal church the universal principle behind that sacrificial system, the universal principle behind that commandment that preserves the validity and the message of the text. So with the sermon idea, we would, instead of talking about the sacrifice, we'll say the sacrifice of Christ is required for you to be reconciled to God. That's true. And so we can understand that. We might phrase it more in the sense of sacrifice is required. And that will pose us the question, what sacrifice? And by the time we get down to our end, a little bit of altar call, that's when we'll talk about Christ. Christ is that sacrifice. So we might actually phrase our sermon idea as sacrifice is required to reconcile us back to God. So we can see there's a little bit of a difference there. It's not a one-to-one. I just want you to be aware of that it's not always a one-to-one, but you can see that by working it a little bit, you can understand the universal principle and understand the sermon idea as derived from the textual idea. I didn't derive something else, I didn't talk about ceremonial washings or anything. I'm still talking about sacrifice. I'm still in the text as it's derived from the textual idea. Okay, so now that we talked about that and kind of got that out of the way, we can start talking about maybe the 90%, which is a lot a lot more of a one-to-one. And by doing that, what we do is essentially eliminate the time pieces of our sermon idea or our textual idea. That is, we're not talking about Moses, we're not talking about Paul, we're not talking about them, the original author, and we're not talking about the original audience. This is a idea, this is a message that we want communicated from God to us today. So what we'll do is we'll take the textual idea and we'll eliminate the original author and the original audience. And what we'll be left with is this question right here, and I'll just copy and paste that as well. All right, and that is what is being communicated to all Christians. So that's what we end up with, and that is our sermon idea as derived from our textual idea. Well, let's make this a little bit more concrete because I'm sure you're kind of wondering, okay, that's all good in philosophy of preaching and how to do this. I call it methodological philosophy, or I forgot how I phrased it in this lesson. You'll see it a little bit later. I talk about methodology or philosophy of methodology. And this is what I'm talking about, kind of getting into the how the structure and the mechanics work. I really don't know what else to call it, so that's kind of what I did. It made the most sense. But you can see we're talking about the mechanics of it. We're not talking about building a specific sermon. Well, let's go ahead and have the rubber meet the road, so to speak, and bring this down to a very practical level on what exactly it is I'm communicating and what exactly is going on here with what I'm saying. Well, I went ahead and chose this text, Galatians 1 6 through 9, and I didn't put much thought into this, to be frank. I really just chose the first text that came to mind. Galatians came to mind, and I just opened the text immediately to the first one. And I wanted to read through Galatians and see where I could get my first text in Galatians 1 6 through 9 kind of Galatians 1, yeah, 6 through 9 kind of came up. And I thought this was a small chunk. This isn't really a sermon per se. This is more of just a message, and I'll go ahead and move it down here, or rather, I'll just move myself up a little bit. And then now we can go ahead and move me down. Move it down. So it says, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you into the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but that there are some who trouble you who want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so I now say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. And even as I was reading through that, to be frank, I kind of started to see a sermon, a sermon in just that. I think it might be preachable in the small amount that we have, and I actually do think maybe this isn't worthy enough of a passage to be a sermon. All right, so let's go back to the sermon template and work with this. Well, the first question we want to ask is, what's the textual idea? And I'm just going to put TI there. What's the textual idea? And as we look at this, the gospel, the communication of the gospel, he's astonished that they have deserted the gospel. So maybe it's about desertion. Or he says that no one should be able to, not we or an angel should be able to preach a gospel contrary to you, uh, to that. So as I was thinking about this passage, I thought, you know what the textual idea is, and I went ahead and wrote this down just so that we can be prepped for this conversation. I'll go ahead and put it down here so it can be on its own. So the textual idea is Paul wants the Galatians, because we're talking about the Galatians, Paul wants the Galatians to know that no one should ever be able to persuade you to believe another gospel. All right, that's pretty much what's being communicated there. Paul wants the Galatians to know that no one should be able to persuade you to believe another gospel. Yeah, that's it. Not we nor angels should be able to preach you a gospel contrary. I'm really astonished that you deserted the gospel, but even if we or an angel, so what is he saying? And it's communicated there in that last verse. As we have said before, now say, if anyone's preaching to you another gospel of Jesus, let him be accursed. Yeah, exactly. So no one should be able to preach to you another gospel. You shouldn't believe anything, not even from an angel. I'm really just justifying how I came to this. So that's the textual idea that I got from this. Well, let's now move into the sermon idea. What can we do here? What we can do is essentially copy and paste this. I think I worded it a little bit differently. Yeah, let's just move this down to this document right here. All right, so I've just copied and pasted it. What I'm going to do is just take out Paul wants the Galatians to know. And actually, I'm going to take out that because that is actually a helping word. And I'll just capitalize this. And boom, there we go. No one should ever be able to persuade you to believe another gospel. That is the sermon idea for Galatians 1, 6 through 9. And there is our sermon idea. No one should ever be able to persuade you to believe another gospel. We might make it a little bit more efficient. Maybe take out ever. No one should be able to persuade you to believe another gospel. Yeah, that's good. That's a little bit more efficient. No one should be able. My grammar isn't the best, so I always rely on spell check and stuff from Word documents. But I think that's a good sermon idea. And that will definitely preach. And in fact, as I was reading through it, there's enough movement in the passage to actually build, I think, a sermon, if not a good Devo, a very good Devo, like maybe a 10 to 20 minute Devo, just from this passage, with this as your sermon idea. And as we can see, we derived our sermon idea from our textual idea. It came from the passage. I didn't choose this. I didn't want to say, hey, I want to teach you guys on sermon ideas. So what we'll do is I want to tell you guys you shouldn't be persuaded. No, I just chose a passage at random. I chose Galatians at random. I started from the top. I started to read down, and I thought, 6 through 9 was enough of a message to actually show you guys how to do a sermon idea. And as I read through it, I thought, actually this is enough to be actually a preaching passage, to be frank. And then we just worked through it together on what the textual idea is and how you get to the sermon idea. So that's our message for the entire sermon. This is what really we're going to be bringing to the forefront, and this is the idea that we want them to walk away with. So that's the sermon idea, and that's what we're going to be really stressing throughout the entire sermon. I hope that was very clear, and from here we'll kind of move into our division statements. See you in the next one.